Hello, I'm Chris Moyer, and this is a Zpryme Now special report. Since March 13th, when the President of the United States declared a state of emergency as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, more than 17 million people have filed for unemployment. Small and medium-sized businesses have shut their doors to abide by shelter-in-place orders at the state and local level. In response to this economic turmoil caused by the coronavirus, the federal government passed the $2.2 trillion Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. To discuss this act and the economic challenges and opportunities facing small businesses at this time, I am joined by Matt Rolling, the Executive Director of Business Innovation at Wayne State University. Matt, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thanks for having me, Chris. It's a pleasure.
The CARE Act has multiple provisions for individuals, large corporations, healthcare, and states. Can you break down the specifics of the $377 billion bill as it specifically relates to small businesses?
Yeah, and I'll start from small to large. The CARES Act includes about $10 billion in emergency, injury, and disaster relief grants, about $350 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program, which is really the centerpiece of it for small business, and then about another $17 billion to help the Small Business Administration restructure loans, existing loans for small business. But the biggest piece of the puzzle is PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program. And PPP, the mission behind, or the intention rather, behind PPP is really to help small businesses that have been negatively impacted by the lockdowns survive. And what does that mean exactly? Well, the loan size is capped at $10 million. And the way that the quantum or the amount of the loan is determined is it's about 2.5 times your average payroll, right? And so if you kind of, turn off parts of your business that aren't essential, you're left with, your payroll, your rent, your insurance, your debt service. And those are all categories of costs that PPP can be used for small businesses in order to borrow the funds and use them to pay those expenses. And for businesses that do take advantage or are able to take advantage of PPP, if they use that money towards those different cost categories within a certain period of time after the loan originates, the money can be forgiven. And so the loan could be converted into a grant. Obviously, $350 billion sounds like a lot of money, but practically speaking, for the number of small businesses that we have in the U.S., it's probably going to run out pretty quickly. However, the Treasury Secretary Mnuchin has said that that this wasn't a one-time deal, and that once the first tranche of PPP has been allocated and spent, that he would go back to Congress and ask for additional dollars.
We've certainly heard potentially 200 billion, and there might be more to follow after that. You mentioned the number of small businesses that exist in the United States, and by some metrics, at the start of March of 2020, there were more than 30 million small businesses in the United States, many of them being sole proprietors. But how many of them are eligible for support under the CARE Act?
Well, it's pretty specific that if you have more than 500 employees, you don't qualify. And that number, there is a little bit of a carve out for food and bev. So if you have restaurant chains, they might look at it through, they give a little bit more, there's a relaxing of the 500 employee rule for restaurants and other food and bev. But if imagine like a traditional private equity portfolio, you might have 5 different companies, and each one of those companies in the portfolio employs 400 people. However, it's looked at from a control perspective, and so in that instance, none of those businesses qualify. So you really need to be a standalone business in the United States, of domiciled in the United States of America, majority owned by American citizens, with 500 or fewer employees.
One of the biggest challenges that small businesses are facing right now in relationship to the PPP is just the uncertainty and the speed with which they are receiving those funds. Can you talk to us a little bit about why loans are taking longer than expected to be distributed?
I don't think anyone's going to get upset for me to suggest that banks and credit unions aren't exactly the most dynamic or risk tolerant parts of the U.S. economy, and so asking banks and credit unions to set up new underwriting standards, new lending procedures, and extra capacity and bandwidth to insert $350 billion into small businesses overnight without a lot of clear guidance from Treasury is a really tall order. And so, it's taken us a little bit of time for our frontline friends at banks and credit unions to really develop strong procedures to put this money out where it's needed. Just to give you a counter example, I believe in Denmark, in Scandinavia, their government, their equivalent to the U.S. Treasury, simply cut checks to businesses to cover payroll for 2 months. Here in the U.S., our government decided that the CARES Act should be slightly more tailored and have different approaches to different companies based on their size, their scale, their ownership structure, et cetera. And so with that more nuanced approach, you require an underwriting apparatus. Underwriting meaning the term for deciding who does or who does not qualify to get the loan. And the U.S. Treasury Department simply isn't capable of making those decisions. And with some exceptions, the SBA, the Small Business Administration, doesn't really have the underwriting capacity to handle literally hundreds of thousands of applications overnight.
Well, Matt, that's a great point. And I certainly think that when you consider that for banks, this whole issue has been compounded by the fact that they are not able to show up to their office and collaborate and look at these loans in a more standardized fashion, that this was going to be a more deliberate rollout than many had hoped for.